Businesses are closed, people are sitting at home, and there's an uncertainty about what will happen once the lockdown is lifted. The tourism industry, religious gatherings, small businesses as well are all impacted. So just how much will the COVID-19 outbreak cost the country's economy? To answer this, I'm joined now via Skype is Economist Sifiso Skenjana. Sifiso, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. Let's get into it. The cost with which the coronavirus has costed South Africa, do we have an estimation as to how much it is?
Yeah, I think any estimation, I think, is as good as mine. But I mean, I think if we take, I guess, an analytical approach to getting to the number, if you remember, just even before we had a coronavirus outbreak, the occupational health, organizations had estimated something like 19 billion was being lost from the economy just from absenteeism. And a subsequent 60 billion was being lost on presenteeism, and that's people who were coming to work sick. And so if you just think that this was just before coronavirus, and then we've got the tourism industry that contributes directly about 150 billion to the economy and indirectly about 450 billion to the economy. And so if more than half of that activity, for example, is ground to a halt, and then we're already starting to look at some of the numbers way beyond 300, 400 billion, and then you look and say, well, which are the sectors in the economy that have been growing? Financial services is one of them. They contribute about 22% of our GDP right now, and we expect insurance claims to go up. We expect, default ratios in banks to go down, to go up. And so profitability in all of these organizations are certainly under a lot of pressure in this current period. And so if you start to incorporate that as well as manufacturing, I think the number could easily go up to, R1 trillion in terms of just the true extent of the economy, of the impact on the economy.
Yeah, it's interesting you also mentioned the tourism sector there. I mean, that industry alone is going through the most. Yesterday I had a conversation with one of my colleagues in KZN, and he was saying after conversation with the MEC of Tourism there that due to the closure of the beaches and the businesses around, at least R1 billion was just lost in that day alone. So the question then is, I mean, how long will it take the country to recover from this post this lockdown?
Well, I mean, that's quite an interesting one, right? So, if you're just seeing some of the February numbers that had come out in terms of employment expectations, funny enough, tourism was one of the sectors that was expecting, job accretion, going into the year. And so they were expecting to employ more people, and primarily because of ports as well as economic activity. And that was mostly coming out of Durban. And so some of the sectors, other sectors hadn't expected pretty much flat growth in employment. And so already you start to see that that's going to have a material impact now on employment outcomes in the economy. And then what does the economy look post-coronavirus? An interesting one, because again, it's going to talk to around the health outcomes of the people who are labor participants in the economy. It's going to talk to the resilience in the businesses post that and say how many businesses have been able to stay resilient through this kind of, period. And so I think, again, as I said, your guess is about as good as mine is what the true state of the economy is going to look like post-corona. But as we said, is that we're certainly going to expect that unemployment numbers are going to certainly get worse. We're going to see a lot more businesses filing for insolvency. And, and the businesses that are able to survive this period are probably going to be the interesting ones to watch post-corona. But it's interesting also that, now we've been forced into this space of digital intensity. And so a lot of the businesses who are now, trying to grow their operations in the digital space are certainly going to be interesting businesses to, I think, look at post-corona.
Yeah. And just before I let you go, Sifiso, I want to refer you to a tweet here. I'm not sure if you're aware of this trending topic right now, but the name in Tabeling is trending, and she's the founder of the Young Women in Business Network Mutual Band. She tweeted, and I'll just read the first part, and she says, and I quote, "So do you guys expect to still get your fully paid annual leave and paid public holidays after this lockdown?" I mean, obviously, this tweet has been met with a lot of controversy, but bearing in mind the labor regulations in the country, what would then be the priority business measures for business to consider for their employees post this lockdown?
And one of the responses to that tweet, which was quite interesting, is that, you plan your business as a hand-to-mouth business, yet you want to give people financial services. And it's quite an interesting response. And I think the whole point is that there are cycles through, in the business cycle in general. And so there are good cycles and bad cycles, and businesses got to plan through the cycle. And that means that, you've got to be able to ensure that you don't take your employees through that kind of intensity when the business is going through a shock. And so I think the tweet is certainly, I don't think, is in the spirit of the economy in terms of truly how businesses ought to be social citizens as well, and to ensure, because we know that 60% of our GDP is driven by household expenditure, and so it becomes a spiral when you go with the cycle. You don't go counter-cyclical, and so some of those things I think is an interesting comment now for even the other business leads to think about and say, what does it mean for me as a business lead to be a social citizen, given the current crisis that we've got in the economy?
Yeah, if there's one organization, though, which does not necessarily care at this moment, it has to be Moody's. I mean, the timing has been also questioned for when Moody's downgraded South Africa into junk status, the effect of that announcement by the ratings agency.
So that's quite an interesting one. And so my view is that the timing is probably better now than later. So if you remember at their last statement, when they had revised our growth outlook to negative, they listed 4 risk items. It was security of energy supply, it was inequality, it was economic growth, and government debt. And all of those risks had materialized. And so had they postponed the decision, it was always going to come down the line. And so I think, the example I made last night was that it's always better to, when the whole class has failed the test, to be part of the people who are failing. So we already saw, for example, even UK having their debt downgraded, and so I think the impact on our currency and outflows is certainly not going to be as bad as it could have been when the entire global economy is on an upward trajectory and we've got to be on a downward trajectory. And again, if you compare in some of the other economies that went through a similar process, like Brazil, their currency didn't take as much of a beating as what was expected, primarily because investors tend to price it in ahead of the actual downgrade. I mean, there was 3 years between Moody's actually downgrading us now and when Fitch and S&P had downgraded us. And so I think a lot of it is currently priced in, and I don't think the impact will be as bad as it could have been had we been the bad apples when the global economy is growing.
Well, always a pleasure talking to you, Sifiso. Thank you so much for your time. That's Economist Sifiso Skenjana joining us about what the cost could be, of course, to South Africa due to this coronavirus outbreak, and also what businesses then need to bear in mind post the lockdown as they try and rebuild, of course, all their losses.